Welcome everybody to Chart Chat. And now I get to say the phrase which I struggle with every single month. It's more than just chit chat, it's chart chat. Jeff came up with that phrase and I can never say it correctly, but it is an awesome phrase. Great to see so many people from where we've got Houston, Miami, Chippenham, Buffalo, Poland, people from all around the world. It's great to have you with us. So let's do quick introductions. My name is Andy Cotgreave. I'm technical evangelist at Tableau. It's great to be here, and I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
Hello, Jeff Shaffer here from Cincinnati, Ohio, Chief Operating Officer at Unifund and Adjunct Professor at the University of Cincinnati. Amanda.
Hey, I'm Amanda Makulec. I am the Executive Director of the Data Visualization Society and the Senior Data Visualization Lead at Excella. And handing it over to Steve.
Hey folks, I'm Steve Wexler. I'm the founder and principal of Data Revelations. I am one of the three authors of the Big Book of Dashboards, along with Jeff and Andy, and the author of The Big Picture. And let me just set the stage of what Chart Chat is. It is something Jeff and I put together almost 3 years ago, and it was to rekindle the wonderful discussions and debates we had while writing the Big Book of Dashboards. We soon were able to wrangle Andy to join us again in the discussion, and we had the good sense to ask Amanda Makulec, the voice of reason and clarity, to join us as well. That has since morphed into a discussion among the four of us too. We have had guests, then special guests, and now very special guests. I'm a little embarrassed to have been participating in extremifying the English language, but I can say that I'm not just excited, but I am super excited as to what we have in store today. And with that, I'm going to hand things back to Andy, who will set things up for us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to have you all here. So one thing Steve said there is the genesis of this was the co-authors of the book. We were arguing and debating about the ins and outs of every single chart in the book, and it was hugely enriching for us. So Chart Chat is our attempt to bring that to life, and you are encouraged to agree or disagree as well throughout this conversation. So do please use the chat, and I'll talk about After Party in a minute. But we have a very special guest. He should introduce himself first. John from the FT. John, say hello. How do you describe yourself in the elevator?
Hi, folks. Yeah, my name's John Burn-Murdoch. I always forget because job titles at the FT are quite fluid, but these days I'm the chief data reporter at the Financial Times. And yeah, I don't know if I'm going to struggle to live up to the billing that I've got here, but I'll do what I can. But it's great to see everyone, and awesome that we've got so many people from all sorts of different places.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, John, it's great to have you with us. For those keen to know what we're going to do for the next hour and a half, if you can stay as well, John's going to talk about three of his big well-known charts that you might well have seen over the last 18 months. Talk about the case charts. We're going to talk about excess death charts, and we're going to talk about it's not animation. That I'm very disappointed. That should be the animation there. So we're going to talk about animation. Maybe when John shares his screen, he can do it slightly more successfully than me. After that, the world famous, since we all know about it, it must be world famous, After Party. So we'll talk for about an hour, maybe a little bit less, and then we hand it over to you who are all watching. We'll make you all attendees. You can open your mic and open your camera if you wish. John's going to stick around to answer more questions, and you can share your own opinions too. So I think that sounds pretty exciting. I'm sure you'll agree. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, hand it over to John. So I guess, John, take it away. First item is the case trackers.
Yeah, cool. So I guess I should start out just by maybe setting a bit of the scene on how these came about and what was sort of going on at the FT and particularly within our team at the start of March 2020, which obviously now feels either a decade ago or a couple of weeks ago, depending on how the pandemic has gone. So in the early months of that year, January, February, we obviously were covering the pandemic already, but seeing it as a sort of Asian story. Initially, we had a sort of big map of case counts in different parts of the world, but it was in late February, early March when it really started feeling a much more sort of imminent issue in Europe and increasingly in the UK. And so I think it was something like the 8th or 9th of March when I got the following email. So this was an email from one of my co-workers on the FT's news desk, who was just asking essentially, do we have data on the day-by-day cases coming out of Italy, which at the time was in all the headlines over here for how bad the situation was looking there, and do we have anything that would allow us to compare that to the UK? So she'd been chasing the local, not local, the government department in the UK that was responsible for this data, but couldn't find exactly what she was looking for. And so I went away to the Johns Hopkins data that was being published at that time and threw together a relatively bare bones, scruffy little chart that you can see here. I think this was sort of March the 10th, maybe. And what the idea of this was just to track the extent to which different countries, such as the UK, were following Italy's path in terms of this rapidly increasing case count in as the outbreak took off. And what we could see here is two main things. First of all, that several East Asian countries had much gentler curves. They'd managed to get on top of the rate of spread in their countries, whereas the UK, the US, and various other Western countries were indeed following exactly where Italy was leading, which at that time was quite scary news for those of us here. And one thing I should point out here is, although I think the FT's version of this chart really took off and became sort of one of the iconic charts at that time, this wasn't something that I came up with out of the blue. So Matt Cowgill, who's an Australian data analyst at the time working at the Grattan Institute, had already been producing a similar types of charts in the couple of days before we did ours. And Jonathan Minton, a health economist in the UK, had been looking at this idea of plotting things on a log scale relative to when the outbreak began. So that this wasn't an original FT idea, but it was something that we really felt worked well and then ran with. And you can see that obviously we didn't publish this straight on the site. We needed to give it that FT polish. So the first step, of course, was just to put it on a pink background and use our fonts and colors. But I think, as you can see, this is still quite a sparse version of what this chart went on to become. And at this point, it's still quite sort of scientific and sterile. So, if you were someone who was used to looking at this data every day, you can work out what's going on here and what the story is being told. But what we really wanted to do with this chart was to make it as accessible as we could to anyone, frankly, because, this was an enormous story. This was probably the biggest story that happened for 70 odd years since the Second World War, really. And we really felt that this needed to be something that we communicated to everyone, not just to data and chart aficionados. So one of the key steps doing that was this step of adding this text, these annotations. So giving people a clear title of the fact that what most Western countries were indeed, as people feared, on the same coronavirus trajectory, heading for where Italy went, whereas certain Asian countries were succeeding. And we felt it was really important to add these annotations showing why it was believed that that the countries were having these successes. So you didn't only learn the what, but you sort of learned the why as well. In terms of a little bit more background as well, the reason that we went for these logarithmic y-axes on this chart was that we felt that, well, if this virus is spreading exponentially, which everyone believed to be the case and indeed was the case at the time, then if you plot things on a linear axis, you get something that looks like this, which is everything showing that similar sort of increasing upward slope. And it becomes quite difficult to answer the actual question we sought to answer, which is, to what extent are these countries following one another? To what extent are they on the same path? Because you've got all of the paths would be curving, whereas by putting them on a log scale, you can almost follow these trajectories as straight lines. It's easier to compare how countries are doing, and it even allows you to do things like this, which is, and this was from let's see, that was March the 16th. So just a few days later, it allowed us to say, okay, well, if the UK continues on its current path, it's about 12 days behind where Italy was. And that was exactly the question we sought to answer with these charts. People were turning on their TVs and seeing pretty grim situations in Italy. And we wanted to tell people when things might get like that in the UK if nothing if nothing was done to change that. So yeah, that's a bit of the backstory. I'm just very quickly as well going to show you a little bit more in terms of behind the scenes on this one. So one thing that we can look at here is how these charts were actually made. So I'm just going to stop sharing and flip over to Illustrator for a second. The very first of the charts was done initially in ggplot using R, and was then just exported as a PDF and styled up in there. So I then just whacked a pink background on this, but this was essentially how that chart was done. So these annotations here were sort of handwritten, as it were. And all of that styling up was done in Illustrator. But we quickly found when we were doing these daily updates that obviously that was a very laborious way of maintaining this chart. So what we then flipped over to was a version where we would generate this graphic just in a web browser using JavaScript, and in particular the D3 library, but essentially just using JavaScript. And that would then generate multiple sizes of this graphic for us to use on desktop and mobile phone and other devices. And if we wanted to do any styling up, we would still just nip over to Illustrator and make slight changes to where we placed annotations. So generating annotations that work equally well on desktop and mobile is obviously very difficult. So we do things like not just like text wrapping, but actually writing more sort of briefer annotations for mobile than desktop. And just to very quickly show you what that looks like in the browser, what we have is essentially we have a set of scripts for any given chart that we want to make in the browser, where it will generate mobile size, desktop size, extra large size, and then also versions of the graphics with different backgrounds that we might want to use on Instagram, for example, or if we were doing a video. So I'll just give you a quick look at what that looks like in practice. And this is essentially what we use for all of our charts. So here's a simple one of how in early March that chart would have looked when we were generating it online. We would get the mobile, tablet, and desktop versions of all of those charts. And you can drag around these labels to make sure they don't overlap. Here's what that looked like a little bit later on in the pandemic. Again, same thing. So obviously this mobile one here is extremely crowded. So all the more need to do things like nudging those labels around. And as these charts got more and more crowded, we thought, well, this is getting a bit unsustainable. So we swapped in these small multiple versions, which got crowded, but in a different way in terms of the number of charts we showed. So this was all while we were building an interactive version of the chart. But in the meantime, we said, well, let's make these small multiples so people can come to the site and see how their country is faring. So we could see at this point, the US had the highest cumulative death rate around. You could see that countries like, if you were in Tunisia, were doing relatively well. If you were in Sweden, you were sort of in the middle of the pack. And so this was our way of filling the gap before an interactive launched. So this would just allow people to come and see how their country was doing. But ultimately, we published this interactive version where people could choose the countries to show and whether they wanted to show linear or log scale and all that sort of thing. So that is a whistle-stop tour to sort of how those charts were made, how they evolved, and what we ended up with.
It's absolutely brilliant. You know what's interesting about that, John, is I'd actually forgotten that the reason the charts were so compelling at the start was because it was oh, how are we doing compared to Italy? I'd forgotten that when I was preparing my notes for today, but that was certainly in Europe the compelling reason to be worried, wasn't it? Yeah. Now, Eric has asked a question, which you can answer. It says, great chart, but wouldn't it be more useful to look at percent of population rather than just number of cases? Then you'd be comparing apples to apples. How come you chose raw numbers at this point in the pandemic?
Yeah, exactly. So these were the sort of questions we started getting inundated with back at that time, to the extent that we actually ended up setting up a completely new email address, coronavirusdata@ft.com, for people to send in questions, comments, suggestions, etc. for these charts. And that inbox was getting hundreds of emails every day from people all around the world with, questions like that, and also suggestions of, can you add data for my country? Here's a link to the data, and all that sort of thing. So we found that I mean, we found this entire process immensely valuable for learning more about what works and doesn't work in charts, because we've had so many bits of feedback about this kind of thing. So what we ended up doing was we produced a video, on the FT, and also one that we distributed on social media and YouTube, which was an explainer of why we'd made these various choices in the chart. And so if we go back to that question, in the early days of the pandemic, essentially in those very early days, population size essentially wasn't having any impact on how numbers were increasing, because at this stage, such a tiny percentage of each country's population had been infected that if you made the chart, let's say cases per 100,000 people or per million people instead of just raw cases, it basically looked exactly the same, except smaller countries looked like they were doing worse and larger countries looked like they were doing better, because in a small country, the same sized outbreak as a large country was just taking up a higher percentage of the population. So all of the slopes were the same. It's just that the lines were offset vertically. But obviously, as time went on, there's only so high the numbers can go in a small country compared to a large one. And so as those weeks went on, it became increasingly clear that the fact that we weren't adjusting for population was starting to become a problem. And that's why when we transition to the interactive version, the default is always to show numbers adjusted for population size. And in the overwhelming majority of charts that we've done since those early days, so since probably sort of April, May 2020, we always adjust for population. So yeah, initially it was just that growth was completely unconstrained by population at that point. And so 100 cases in the UK and 100 cases in the Netherlands looked essentially the same. But yeah, as soon as that did become a factor, we did switch to that.
Yeah, brilliant. Amanda, you had a question about data quality.
Yeah, and from a public health perspective, I mean, when you're looking at an initial outbreak, you're looking at every single individual case mattering so much, versus as you get to kind of looking at population level statistics, you're just plotting things in a different way. So I think it's interesting seeing how that transition, John. I know one of the things I admired a lot early on is seeing you reaching out and asking people questions about the data. I know I've written a lot about kind of the challenges of plotting COVID, or especially early on when data was really incomplete. And I have this recollection of you putting out tweets of like, what happened to data in Italy on this day or this time? And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to some of the ways in which you created those kind of crowdsourced data quality checks and things that you did to make sure that what you were amplifying and sharing was accurate and complete data in a time when some countries were still setting up surveillance systems and testing infrastructure to even get a picture of what COVID looked like.
Yeah, I mean, amazingly good questions. And this for me, covering the pandemic has been a constant learning exercise, whether it's learning the actual sort of biology and how this stuff all works, or in this case, yeah, learning what data we can trust and what data we can't. And that's kind of in different ways as true today as it was 18 months ago. Like the last story I worked on a couple of days ago was still a story about data problems and how things can be misleading. So back in March and April, that was obviously especially acute because for loads of countries, we just had no data at all. And then there were some countries where the data looked extremely suspicious because we would see, for example, pretty much as many deaths as cases in some countries, which just immediately showed that the overwhelming majority of cases weren't being captured. There were all sorts of countries where you would have numbers going sort of 5, 6, 7, 92, -4, 0, that kind of thing. Like negative numbers of cases and enormous peaks and troughs were pretty much the norm back then. Mm-hmm. There were huge differences in how different countries recorded things. So not just in terms of how much testing was being done, but some countries said they counted deaths as COVID deaths if someone died within a certain number of days of a positive test. Others used doctors' assessments of whether it was likely COVID was involved. So for a long time, for example, Belgium looked very bad for COVID deaths on any chart that you looked at, but that's because Belgium also included suspected cases of COVID and not just those who tested positive. So there were enormous numbers of adjustments we had to make to try and deal with that stuff. There were countries who would sort of retrospectively adjust their numbers both up and down, which caused all sorts of issues. So sometimes we would just sort of plot the data as it was. Other times we would try to deal with it ourselves. So if a country said, we're adding 5,000 cases to our total, but these occurred over the last month, then we would distribute those cases across the past month before we plotted them on the chart, instead of showing an artificial spike. So yeah, there were huge issues. There were countries whose data we plotted on our charts, and then readers would tell us, well, here's the context from my country, and here's why that data doesn't mean what you think it does.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons we moved on to things like excess deaths, for example, which we'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, it's been a constant challenge. And we've written several stories about problems with the data, just as we've written stories about what the data actually shows. So yeah, that's been a constant journey and continues to be.
Oh, the one thing you just said that popped out to me as I'm thinking about how other journalists covered this too, John, from a data visualization perspective, is you decided to then put that data and pad that data back into the previous days, versus say like the New York Times that started adding kind of different visual indicator. They had these kind of light yellow bars that would indicate there was an artificial spike. The Lancet covered like the ways in which case definitions changing in China impacted that. In terms of thinking about how those charts and how you communicated that decision to your readers differed from other journalists, did you give some thought to kind of how to communicate those changes and why that might look different on the FT versus somewhere else?
Yeah, so this has been one of the most interesting things in terms of different approaches. Like, do you show the stuff that you know is wrong, but then annotate that, or do you try and remove it yourself? And I think not always, but generally we've taken that latter approach of like, if we know for sure that this is an artifact, like if the country in question has said, we've changed our definitions, or we've added in these cases which didn't all occur on this day, we've sort of felt, well, let's cut out the middle person and just plot what we believe actually happened, because it kind of takes up a lot of the visual bandwidth on a chart to show a spike that didn't happen and add a footnote saying so. And the way the New York Times did it, I think, is great as well, because as long as you're highlighting in situ what happened, I think you're fine. But the problem is the difficulty is when you show something to be kind of a data artifact, and then you put a footnote on your chart saying, here's why that looks weird. So many people just won't see that footnote. So in quite a few cases, especially when data from a particular country is really, really noisy for reporting reasons, not for what's actually happening reasons, we've tried to smooth that out, because we sort of see it as our responsibility to show what actually happened rather than what was recorded to have happened, if we know that that's the case. But yeah, it's a fascinating one, and there's definitely no right or wrong there. I think it's just really interesting to see how different people treated it.
That's great. I love that. One of the things Steve talks about all the time in his workshops is iterate and learn, get feedback. And you did that at possibly the biggest scale you could ever have imagined as a data journalist. Steve, I think you had a question.
A couple of questions. One is, anytime you see a Financial Times chart, it's coming from the Financial Times. It's that telltale background color. And this is a somewhat vapid question, but you said it was pink. You said the background color is pink. Does anyone else see this background color as being pink? I'm freaking out at the moment.
I suspect you're in the majority there. We've always referred to this as pink. I think it's because in the very, very early days of the FT, like more than 100 years ago, the paper was more clearly pink, and the tint has changed, and it's now, some people say salmon or beige or all sorts of things, but because it was pink and therefore the FT had the nickname of being the pink one, we still call it that, but it does fall into that range of, it's not clear exactly what color it is. But yeah.
Chat is going, there's a lot of upvotes for peach on chat. On chat.
We'll call it Financial Times pink, and there you've got the branding of it.
Yeah.
The other question I have is around sort of your mental health during this process. Our deeply flawed governor of New York State had some brilliant moments, and this is Andrew Cuomo, when he was saying how important it was to have facts and information. It was a way to triumph over fear. Did you find working on this stuff when we were all thrust into this science fiction movie in March of 2020? Did you find it helped you to have an understanding of it? This is going to help me understand it, what's going on, what's happening, and I can present it to others. And the flip side of that, was it hounding you constantly? that you're trying to fall asleep and you realize, oh my God, we need to add multiple reference lines to show here's a line that shows increasing every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, things like that. So I'm just wondering about what it was like to live with all this stuff so early on.
Yeah, I mean, great questions. I think in terms of the sort of what that information did for a sense of clarity, I think to be honest, I think to the extent that it did give a sense of clarity and sort of stability, it was probably a slightly false sense, because again, this data was so messy that it was only ever probably giving us a fuzzy idea of what was going on. But I do think it did feel like it was helping, and both for me and for I think most people who are looking at this stuff. I think a curious thing that happened was I was putting these charts out on social media basically every evening for those first few weeks, and it got to the point where if I hadn't put them out yet by say 6-7 p.m. UK time, I would have hundreds of people saying to me, "Where are the charts?" Because it had just become a sort of part of their daily routine. And some of that is purely like habit, and it doesn't especially mean that they were actually providing useful information. But I think a lot of it was people wanting to know what's going on, and these charts gave them a sense of knowing that. And it certainly for me did help, because I felt more sure, still not completely sure, but more sure that I knew what situation various countries were in, including the UK. And in terms of my own impact sort of on my own stress levels, it was, it was an incredibly busy time. But I think for me, when you're working hard on something and you're busy with something, but that work feels incredibly important and sort of immediately rewarding, and you get the feedback that people are finding this really useful, I sort of find that my sort of threshold for how much work I can do without feeling like I'm reaching the limit sort of goes up. And obviously I'm not saying this would be true for everyone, and I don't mean to encourage people to work long hours, but I find that I can be as drained by working 6 hours on something that I'm not engaged with, or something that feels sort of not very important, or if not more drained than working, say, 10 hours on something that feels like the most important thing in the world. So it was a lot of work. And I should also say, like, that's my view of it. But I think my partner, for example, might not share my thoughts that working 10 hours was completely fine. So you've got to think about other people with these things. But yeah, at the time, it was a lot of work, but it really never felt like I was sort of making myself do this. It felt like it was just something that really had to be done.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I've got a question, John, about some of the chart design choices. I think if you go to one of the other slides, sort of the sort of final iterations of this, I mean, you chose a log scale, right? The reasons why, but you had to educate thousands of people daily about what that meant. But I think was there a design choice in terms of the layout for that? And then some of the other little things, like why are some of the dots black? What other little small design choices did you stick into these charts that you think made a big difference?
Yeah, great questions. On the log scale, I will just show one of the charts that I always like to show with these things, which is Google search interest in log scales during the pandemic. And so that really took off enormously, basically at the time that we, and again, to be fair, other people started publishing charts with a log scale. So that for me was one of the nice things, because a huge number of people didn't understand what log scales are, because we're talking here about people who probably don't look at charts usually at all, but because there's a pandemic on, they suddenly had to. And everyone was saying, what's a log scale? And I think it was actually really nice showing that, this idea that you should never challenge people in charts, as long as you give people a pointer and say, hey, sure, you've not seen this chart type before, but here's what it is. This chart here really, to me, demonstrates that people took that information, ran with it, and learned something. And I think the number of people who understand what a log scale is now has probably gone up enormously. But yeah, going back to the charts themselves. So, I think there's one valid question to ask is, well, why did we choose to include the particular breaks in this series? Why didn't we say, for example, show 100, 1000, 10,000, just keep it in constant multiples, which might have made it clearer why, or sort of what a log scale is and why we were using one. I think that's actually a really good point. And if we were to do this again, one thing we would probably do is to always use constant multiple ticks in the log scale, just to make it that bit clearer. Because as it is at the moment, I think not only are people dealing with the fact that it's a log scale, but they're seeing these inconstant gaps in the numbers and going, why does it go 125, 125, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In terms of colors and that kind of thing, the initial color choices was essentially arbitrary. We thought, well, let's do shades of blue for the Asian countries who seem to be doing relatively well, because blue, in a sense, connotes something going relatively well, at least when you compare it to sort of reds and pinks. And then we put the little dots for each point on the line, and then just highlighted the last point on each line. But if I go to one of the other charts, for example, that we did later on, there's obviously more going on in this one. So in this one, we've done a few things. At one funny point, you'll see that we've moved the Financial Times logo into the body of the chart, and that's because we found a lot of people were just sharing our stuff on social media and sort of cropping off the logo. So for those who don't recognize the peach or pink, they wouldn't have known where it came from. So that was something I actually discussed with the FT's press office to say, how should we make sure that we're getting the sort of credit, as it were. The other additions on this chart, so we've got the fact that we're now showing certain countries highlighted in color and labeled, but a lot of gray ones in the background that are just sort of there for context. Because we just decided, look, we can't label all countries, that just wouldn't work. And we've also added these stars to show when different countries went into lockdown. And I'm not sure whether that necessarily worked, the stars. I think at the time we felt, well, look, this is becoming an important part of the discussion. Are lockdowns helping? So we decided to add them on. But obviously, when things are crowded, it can be hard to see exactly which star refers to which country. So I think we probably reached and maybe exceeded the amount of information you can get into one chart. But this was all the type of stuff we were doing. And at the bottom, you can see we changed from days to weeks when the data got to this point. All sorts of things like that. So there was a constant evolution of like, what are we showing? How many things are we showing? What are we adding or subtracting in these charts?
That's amazing. I mean, for me, it's the iteration from a design perspective, I think is, an incredible learning point from this. And so right, look, we've done a lot on that one. We could do a whole hour on that. Maybe we should have done, but we've got more great charts. About terrible data, but great data viz to talk about. So the next one we were going to move on is excess deaths, because eventually the story slightly changed, didn't it? So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So this was these are these charts we started doing to show excess deaths, which for the unfamiliar is this idea that you look at in any given place at any given time, how many people are dying compared to, well, in 2020 or 2021 compared to a typical year. And with this, this was essentially to try and address this issue of different countries recording COVID deaths differently, both in terms of their definitions and the fact that some countries just weren't able to test enough people to ever capture their full death toll. And so this was a tricky one to try and work out how to visualize. And again, the FT was not alone in doing this. The Economist were the first ones to chart excess deaths, and then shortly after we did this, the New York Times sort of joined in as well. But there was so many questions of, well, do you just visualize this single number? Do we just keep it as a simple line chart showing numbers of excess deaths over time? But our feeling was, well, the concept of excess deaths is sufficiently unfamiliar to people that we probably want to show kind of implicitly show what excess deaths are. And the thinking there was, well, okay, if we show directly, explicitly how many deaths typically occur in each country over the course of a year, and then show this year or the pandemic alongside that, or plotted immediately above it, then you can kind of see what we're measuring with excess deaths, which is like how much higher is this year's line compared to a normal line. And so there's a lot of stuff layered on these charts. So if I just sort of zoom in for a little bit. You've got these grey lines in the background, which are deaths in a typical year, with a black or very dark grey line showing the number of deaths we would therefore expect at a given point in 2020 or 2021. And then the red line showing what actually happened with the gap between the two shaded. So you can see in the UK, there was this very steep spike in March and April above what would normally happen. Then things went back to normal for a few months before rising again over the winter, and then have been relatively close to normal since then. In other countries, you can see slightly different patterns. So Armenia, where the data is a bit less granular, had bumps like that. Bulgaria didn't really have anything, and then suddenly had two surges. Other interesting ones. So Ecuador was one of the countries where the official numbers were very, very low, but it turned out there had been enormous numbers of deaths that they weren't able to capture because they weren't doing sufficient numbers of tests. Denmark, by contrast, and several other northern European countries had very few excess deaths at all over the pandemic. So in this case, essentially zero. You had countries in Latin America like Mexico where things got really bad at the most recent winter, but up until that point hadn't been too bad. And then the US, where there'd been a sort of steady rolling wave, and numbers since this chart was made, numbers have started to go up again. So it was trying to pack a lot of information into one place. A couple of the other interesting things we did on this one were this idea of a sort of narrative legend for the chart. So when you've got this number of different sort of visual components to each chart on the small multiple, it felt like it would be quite a lot of work for the reader, the viewer, if we just did a sort of conventional legend with gray line recent years, red line 2021. And so we thought, can we do something where we sort of turn that into an actual readable explainer? So we've said number of deaths per week from all causes, and then sort of built that red line into the bit saying 2020 and 2021. And then we've shown the grey lines for the recent years. We've shown that the shading therefore indicates what we're really talking about, which is excess deaths. And the red text is telling you how many and at what percentage that means in terms of excess deaths. So a lot of stuff going on in this one. I think, and based on feedback, I think most people seem to think that those design choices worked. I think one question we did get was people who were a bit confused about the vertical scale. So because these charts are already very, very crowded just with the lines and the information on them, we felt it was getting too crowded if we put multiple ticks, multiple breaks on our y-axis. So if we'd had, for example, for Azerbaijan here, if we had lines saying 0, 4,000, 8,000, 12,000, 16,000, it's too much to fit in. Even if it just said 0, 8, and 16, it was starting to get a bit crowded, especially because in many cases, some of your text would run over the chart. So in earlier versions of the charts, we did have a central, we had a middle tick. So we had 3 ticks there with values on. But when we went back to just showing the bottom and the top, I think for people who are already familiar with these charts, they'd grasped what was going on there. They fully understood it. But some people, a couple of people wrote to us and said they didn't understand what this number, for example, the 7,000 per week here meant. They thought it might refer to the total number of excess deaths. They didn't necessarily read it as an axis tick, an axis label. They just read it as some other sort of summary figure applying to that chart. And it was a very small number of people who said that. And I think they were probably people who hadn't seen the early versions of the chart and just weren't sure. And so we replied to them and said, here's how to read it. But it's just another example of how once you try and pack a certain amount of stuff into a chart, you're going to get trade-offs into how clear you can be about what each of those components means. And so I definitely think with these, I think they worked pretty well in terms of showing all of those different components that we wanted to include. But there were probably some trade-offs where by trying to, a bit like with the previous ones, by trying to pack so much in, you're going to probably go over the heads of some people. And then another thing I'll just show you on the same theme was that and you can see again, yeah, we did different things for mobile and tablet screens as well. When we started making these charts in March and April 2020, we obviously didn't necessarily think the data was going to run into 2021.
No.
So our x-axis just ran from January to December. But then I remember towards sort of mid-December 2020, us at the FT and people at The Economist and the New York Times and other people, other sort of non-journalists who'd been making these charts, like lots of chatter among us on social media, for example, saying, hey, so what are you thinking of doing for when we get data from January? Like, how are you going to plot your charts? Are you going to do sort of start a line again on the left? Are you going to sort of do a separate chart altogether? What are you thinking? And we thought, well, kind of the time span we're interested in is just however long the pandemic goes on for, however long we want to plot these charts relative to the equivalent months. And so it in a way, we felt it doesn't really matter that this axis is now running for a year and a half instead of 1 year. And those gray and black lines, which represent a typical year, are essentially now repeating themselves again in the background. We felt that, well, that the fact that we're then plotting the background data twice doesn't really feel like it's a problem, because what continues to matter is to what extent is a red line above or below the black and gray lines. And if we'd started things again on the left, then how do you plot two areas, for example, over the top of each other? And so for us, we decided to go with this approach. I think most people have gone with that approach that I've seen. I think maybe the New York Times didn't use filled areas, they just used lines, and I think they may have started again on the left, but that was our thinking with that one. And then just finally on the excess death charts, we also did this version for the US, where we decided to do a sort of gridded cartogram, or a geofacet as it's known in other places, where we could show each state's excess death trajectory, or in the case of New York City, the city itself, in the rough location of where that state was. And we decided to do the US national figure at the top. And the thinking with this was partly just that if you're going to plot a grid of all of the states, then in order to allow readers, viewers to quickly find their state most quickly, one option is, of course, you just do it alphabetically. But then you're still asking people to sort of work their way through the alphabet to like Louisiana or South Dakota, for example. Whereas in this instance, you can, if you know roughly where your state is, like in terms of the Northwest, the Northeast, the South, that kind of thing, then you can probably reasonably easily find it on this grid, and therefore find what matters to you. So first of all, in terms of a device for allowing people to find the point of interest to them, but also because this graphic then works on two levels. So first of all, for any given state, you can zoom in and say, how did things look in Arizona? How did things look in the Northeast? But you also get this national view of how the pandemic in spring 2020 was these very steep peaks in the urban Northeast of the US. And most of those states have not, or until last winter, hadn't really had much of a resurgence in deaths from COVID. Whereas in the South, there was no such steep peak in the spring, but things then took off in the late summer. And in other parts of the country's patterns look quite different. So it allows you to have this one view, which is how did the pandemic play out in different parts of the US as the year drew on, but then you can also zoom in and see more details. So yeah, those are two examples of what we did with those charts, but interested to hear what people think of this.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
As a native New Yorker, I've just got to say thank you for having a separate tile just for New York City. So,
I mean, as it happens, that was just because the data we're using split out NYC. But if it had done that for other cities, we'd have tried to do the same. But we did get a couple of people saying, "Why have you only split out New York City?" But yeah, that was the thinking.
Yeah. Fascinating how geofacets or hex maps only seem to work for the US because it's a squarish country. When you try and do them on Norway, so I saw a Norway hex map once, and I was like, that doesn't work. They don't seem to work in the UK very well either.
Yeah.
But super powerful. There's loads of really great comments on the chat. By the way, so, Bruce said in the grid one, if you'd sorted it by the most to least excess deaths, you might have seen different patterns. But I think, as you say, there's alphabetical gives you a different way of, people can look up their own country as well. But I don't know, Amanda, Jeff, or Steve, got any questions?
I think the thing that stands out to me is, and I really love the way we looked at excess deaths. In the US version, time is the same scale. Your y-axis is comparable, so lower lines versus higher lines. But in the country version, it's a different comparison, right? Each block has to be looked at separately. You can't really compare one block to another because one's on a 1.5-year timeline and another's on a 2-month timeline. So the spike isn't showing in the same place. And as you pointed out, the volume isn't in the same place. So to me, they kind of serve two different purposes. I guess in this one, you're really not making a comparison. This is more of a reference table just to look up your country versus, in a typical small multiple, you could make a comparison from one to the other.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly right. So that was one of the tricky things with the excess death data. When we decided we wanted to plot the data for not just for this year, but for the historical average, that kind of means it makes it quite difficult to normalize the plots and put them on the same scale, because there's no such thing as really percent if you do it that way, because given that you're showing the raw values both for the past and the current year, you kind of have to keep them in the same units. Now, one thing would have been to just do a simple population adjustment again. So if we just did this like per million people, for example, then at least everything is on the same vertical scale. As it happens, I don't think there was ever a reason we didn't do that. We just never discussed switching to a population adjusted version. So what we did with these is we tried to normalize them as well as we could in terms of just allowing the chart to fill the space in such a way that when you have more shaded red, generally speaking, in a chart, that means you had a higher relative excess. So in countries like Canada, for example, where there have been very few excess deaths, because we're filling the space, the chart sits higher up, and therefore any excess that you do get takes up less space than in a country like Peru, where the excess was so huge that pushes everything down. So they're sort of pseudo-normalized, but you're right. The idea with this one is, like you say, sort of a comprehensive reference of everything that you can then look at. But we had an accompanying chart that we publish in the same page as this, which is just a simple bar chart, which ranks all the countries by total number of excess deaths and then adjusted for population as well. So yeah, that was always one of the trade-offs with this one. And it's interesting that the folks at Our World in Data, for example, their approach for this has purely been to plot the number of excess deaths, just as if it were any other single series of data. So that does then allow you to just do bar charts and line charts comparing and using the same baselines. So I think, yeah, this chart is kind of a specific visualization for digging into what happened in any given country. But if we wanted to make this easier for those country to country comparisons, we would probably take the approach of simply showing a single percentage value for every week or month in each country, percentage above normal. And that would be what you could then just combine into a single chart or show on a consistent y-axis.
Fascinating. Amanda, Steve?
I mean, this to me just feels like such a cumulative effect of lots of tiny little design decisions, John.
Yes.
And there are things that I didn't even notice till you were talking through this. Like I suddenly want some kind of reference point on the x-axis for where the year changes from 2020 to 2021, because I hadn't even noticed that myself, and how these aren't really on comparable timescales. And I've looked at this chart a lot. And so I think that it's interesting hearing you reflect on the ways in which some of those were made. And I'm curious, you said there are things you might have changed about your previous chart around the kind of the ticks on the y-axis. Are there any of those small design decisions or things that you would change about this chart, looking at it now and having had it be consumed in different ways over the course of the past year and a half?
Yeah, excellent questions again. So the one thing I'd say about the x-axis is they are all on the same scale. It's just that the last point that is plotted is at different points. So for example, where the Azerbaijan data ends in February, the end of that line is still the 2nd of July, as it is for the UK. So horizontally they're consistent. It's just that because of lags in data reporting, they actually take the actual chart runs for different amounts of that space. But I think you're right that, for example, having another tick in the axis for the change in the year would be an immediate improvement, partly just to more clearly flag that happened, and also because a lot of countries saw spikes in their excess deaths over the winter, the Northern Hemisphere winter. So that would be a useful reference point for people to see that was when those spikes occurred. I think in terms of other changes, again, maybe sort of trying to more explicitly show that the y-axis is an axis, and it's not just sort of a number at the bottom and the number at the top. We could even if we didn't have a label on a central tick, we could at least have a vertical line here with a couple of ticks on, just to make it more implicitly clear, at least that is what those numbers are doing. And then beyond that, I think it would really be a sort of completely different approach to this, which would be to do something similar to our world in data, in terms of maybe we keep this chart, but we also have one which is a more conventional line chart over time, where you can just show whichever countries you're interested in and do those more direct comparisons. Great.
Yeah, I absolutely fascinating. I just to reiterate what Amanda said, that the amount of tiny decisions is always quite astonishing in when you go down and publish a chart. It's amazing documenting those little decisions. Steve, sorry, did you have a question?
Just want to make sure, John, you're getting a lot of love in the chat, and I know it's hard for you to monitor, but the explanation in the legend, and I will say, just thinking about how what it would take, how I would present this data, it stresses me out to imagine, oh my gosh, so much stuff in such a small amount of space, so many design considerations. What a brilliant piece of work. So thanks for the contribution.
Well, thank you, folks. And yeah, it was, again, one of these things where I think if I started this today, I'd be daunted by how much work it would take. But at the time, there was this sense of like, we really need to get something out on this. And so it all sort of flew by. But yeah.
Marco's just asked how much time has it taken to come up with this viz? I mean, have you tried quantifying the amount of hours you've spent on one of these charts?
I haven't, and I dread to think what the answer would be, because this was the kind of thing that was probably I would just have sort of worked on this for about a week while talking to the other reporters who were working on this story. That's the other interesting thing about these charts, that pretty much they were all initially produced for one news story, and then they became the things that we updated all the time. But just quickly, one thing I did keep open just to show people. So this is the folder on my machine where I have all of these files that open up each of the COVID charts that I make, and there's a lot of stuff here.
Wow.
And these are only the ones that I've done using this particular template. So yeah, a lot of stuff there, which is just the charts that I've worked on COVID. So yeah, there's if anyone ever does want to do one day some kind of research into like how news organizations do charts, or any of the feedback we got to that email address, I'm sure there's a wealth of information we could share.
Yeah. Well, if anybody's listening and wants to take that up, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, any PhD students who are hanging out in our chat right now?
Yeah. I did you also measure the change in your Twitter engagement rates? Because you can get that number from Twitter, but it must have been astonishing.
I mean, there was something interesting in how sort of Twitter engagement would go up during the waves of the virus and then would subside again. And I've said to a couple of people recently, it sort of feels like I've got long COVID reporting now, in the sense that it sort of keeps going on, even though it's less acute, as it were. But yeah, I mean, that was a whole thing as well. Just in a way, it was good for me, because I very, very quickly, very early on, realized that I couldn't check my notifications on Twitter, because there weren't enough hours in the day to read them.
Yeah.
And so I developed probably a healthier Twitter habit as a result, because I now have to be much more selective in what I actually look at. So yeah.
That's great. Great. Well, fantastic. Okay, well, we've got one more chart to do, and it involves movement and spending time to get to your conclusion.
Yes. So
oh, there
that
you go.
was,
Yours is animating. Why
so there we go. These ones are animating. Yeah. So this is obviously going to loop. So if you don't catch it the first time, you'll get it next. It might be a little bit shaky, but
it's good. It's pretty good.
Cool.
Yep.
So with this chart, we wanted to answer this big question over the winter in the UK, at least, but I'm sure in other countries as well, as the virus started to spread again in November and December and into January, were we seeing something that was extraordinary and a really, really concerning situation, or was this not hugely dissimilar to what we would see in a typical winter with the flu? Because most people in the UK are fairly familiar with the idea that the National Health Service over here always comes under a degree of strain in the winter because more people are getting ill from respiratory viruses. And so a lot of people who were in the habit of sort of downplaying the threat of coronavirus, of COVID, started saying, well, as numbers were going up in November and December, they started saying, well, this happens every year with the flu. Is this really any different? Do we really need to have another lockdown and more restrictions, for example? And it was actually not immediately easy to answer that question of, well, how does this compare to the flu? Because although that data existed, it was, before COVID, no one was really in the habit of routinely tracking down data on respiratory viruses and how they spread over time. So it took, I'd been wanting to make this chart for several weeks by the time I finally did. And that was mainly because I was trying to track down all the data. But it turns out there were these charts of annual, well, sort of each winter's ICU, like intensive care admissions for flu in the UK for the last 7 or 8 years. And so I tracked down that data. I can't remember actually whether the data was, I don't think there were actually spreadsheets available. So I had to go into the images in these PDF reports and use a tool to pull out the data points from those. And then it was a question of, okay, well, how do we plot this? How do we chart this effectively? And initially, I would have just done a chart like this one. There's the static version, which just shows all of those previous years of flu seasons in gray, and then shows the COVID year as it was at that time in red. And to be clear, the line ended up going up considerably further than that, probably to about the top of this this slide here. But looking at it, I sort of felt, well, when you've got something that's really about a contrast, that's really about how something has happened that is very different to the things that came before, what would this look like if we animated it? And that's where I settled on this idea of animating each year. So you sort of build up this expectation of what the winter normally looks like for the UK in terms of respiratory viruses. So we say, okay, like you get these spikes in December, January, February, March, and they go up to sort of 4 people per million. And then in a bad year like this, it's going up to 6 per million. And so, okay, this like 6 looks like quite a bad year then. And how does that compare to COVID? And so the line then shoots up to 24. So like 4 times what was previously considered a bad year. And indeed, as I say, it went on to go up to more like 7 or 8 times. And we just felt that felt like a much more effective, a much more powerful way, of showing what happened. The static version is not wrong. It's not showing anything different really, but it has less impact because it's really the shock of how different COVID is to a normal year that is what makes this one effective. And some people went away and said, okay, well, sure, that red line for COVID goes up a lot more, but maybe that's just because we're testing more for COVID than we usually test for flu. And so we said, okay, well, let's look at something slightly different, which is, what if we just look at the total numbers of people in intensive care in London, for one example, over winter and how that compares to this year. So it doesn't matter who's being tested for what, we just want to see how many people are in intensive care for any reason. And once again, you see this enormous surge. And again, I'll just show you the static version of that. So even if you put aside testing completely, you still get this big spike. And again, this line ended up going up much further. And again, it was the feeling that this is more powerful when you show it this way, because what you're kind of doing is you're saying to the sort of COVID skeptics, you're sort of answering their question in real time. You're saying, okay, so you're saying that maybe this is just a normal year. Well, let's give you an idea of what a normal year looks like. All of these figures are in that sort of 700, 750 people range. So how does this year look? And then you sort of shatter those expectations and show them how much higher it is. So again, that felt like the best way to do this. And in terms of the sort of reaction these got, I think these were actually the most widely shared charts that we've done on anything for the whole pandemic. And it's not just because they're animations, it's because they were answering this because they were answering this huge question that everyone had at that time, which was, is this just another bad flu season, flu winter, or is this something on the next level? But I think it was helped by the fact that they were animated, so they told that story more powerfully. Part of me also thinks that this kind of makes them more accessible as well to non-chart people, because if you just give someone a chart and say, look at this, then they're going to be like, okay, so there's like those gray lines and then there's a red line, and I guess, yeah, okay, the red line is higher than the gray line. Whereas if you sort of hold the viewer's hand through this and say, here's 1 year, here's a second year, here's a third year, as they're watching it, even if they've not really seen charts before, they're getting this idea of here's what normal looks like, and then here's something that's very much not normal. So yeah, that was my thinking behind doing these, and it seemed to work. But I'm the first person to say that doesn't mean that you should now do all your line charts as animations. I think there are relatively few. I literally think it's probably something like 1 in 100 line charts works well as an animation. Like, you know, any line chart I think works as an animation to an extent, but there's a lot where all you're really doing is adding some sort of shiny gloss, but you're not really doing something particularly special. But I think in any example like this, where you want to show here's what normal looks like and then here's something different, and you know, the last 18 months have been pretty full of examples of that kind of thing. I think it can be an effective use. So yeah, we've not followed this up by a sort of flood of interactive charts on the FT, but of animated charts, sorry, on the FT. But I think every now and again, when the time is right, it can be a good way to go. But yeah, interested to hear what everyone thinks about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've been so engrossed. I've realised it's 5 past the hour. So for those, if people have to drop off, sorry we're overrunning, but we're gonna keep going and turn to the after party and open the mic. So yes. So that just I lost track of time. It's so compelling, but yeah. So I agree with you, Jed, John. You know, animations, they take a long time to get to the point, but when there's a big punchline, it's definitely more compelling. Yeah, so I completely agree. I love the little flourish of the pulsing.
Yes,
the pulses in the title. Was that just a random brainwave that you kind of came about, the way the year expands?
Yeah, so I've been making animated charts for, like, again, not regularly, but occasionally, for probably like 3 or 4 years. Using, someone asked how this was made. So this again was in D3. There's obviously loads of software you could use, things like After Effects. I've used D3 just because that's what sort of all my charts were made in, and it's relatively easy in JavaScript to start just setting timers for different things to happen. But from the charts like this that I've done in the past, I've always felt that you can really use things like a pulsing of color, or of the weight of a font, for example, to draw people's attention to what's going on. And what I really wanted to do here, that the whole aim was to make this as accessible as possible. So you want people to know what's happening at every point. So when a new line comes in, you don't want them to be thinking, wait, what's happening here? Like, what's this other line? And so by sort of matching the pulsing of, and now this is what's being shown, and now this is what's being shown, it's an attempt to make it as clear as possible. Like, the thing that just changed on the chart. Here's what it is. So yeah, that was the thinking, and I just feel like that's always pretty effective. The challenge with these ones is always how much can you reasonably expect someone to be able to take in when each line comes in, for example. And I think it's entirely likely that some people probably watched this once without realizing that the years were pulsing, and then maybe watched it the second time and realized, oh right, the years were being shown up there. So I think, and again, the nice thing about an animation is pretty much whatever way you show it, it will all loop by default. So people will immediately sort of Netflix style go straight into the next one and see what's going on. But yeah, for me, it's all about just minimize the risk that someone doesn't understand things, but while trying not to have too much going on. Like, for example, if we'd had annotations pulsing into view on this chart at the same time, I think that would have been overdoing it. And you reach a point where people watch it and then they just sort of scratch their head and maybe they just leave it. Yeah. But I think a little bit of that hand holding, as it were, can again be a big help to make sure people understand it.
Absolutely. Yamil says Yamil wants this pulsing in Tableau as soon as possible. It's like, well, I can't promise anything, but I do know Kevin Flurlidge is on the call, hiding in the background.
I can guarantee you, Andy, there are at least 10 people on this.
Somebody's working on it.
All right, I'm going to make this and figure out how to make this in Tableau.
So we'll have that in the next chart chat, please, community. That'd be great. All right. Well, look, I think let's move on to the after party. And so if Steve, Amanda, and Jeff have a couple more questions on this chart, we can take them there. So
I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to move and make everybody a panelist so you can open up and ask questions. So I'm going to stop the recording unless there's any.
There was actually one thing I wanted to say. Oh dear! Before you all disappear, Amanda, you had something to say about.
Oh yes,
didn't you?
Just a quick plug that Data Visualization Society, the group that I lead, launches our print magazine. We launched last week. So if you're interested in more print publications of data visualizations and not just looking at cool things on digital environments, you can subscribe or join as a paid member with a subscription option. And you can find this at datavisualizationsociety.org. So feel free to check that out and reach out if you have any questions. Very exciting to have more print data viz that we can hold in our hands.
Yeah. Ooh, tactile data viz. I love it. So I can't wait. Right. Okay. So technically, what, Steve? What do you have to do? The little handover moment?
We're going to stop the recording, and then we're going to click on every attendee and promote them to panelists. So,
all right.